I'm really honoured to be joined by the acclaimed Palestinian British writer, director, Ahmed Masoud, who is from Gaza, from Jabalia. He's lived in the UK now for over 2 decades. His brilliant work includes Vanish, The Mysterious Disappearance of Mustafa Huda, Come What May, also as well as books, theatre, radio, Camouflage, The Shroud Maker, and Escape from Gaza. Now, I've been meaning to speak to Ahmed for a long time. I've been following his Twitter feed throughout this catastrophe, this crime, the genocidal onslaught, of course, against Gaza by Israel, armed and backed by our governments. And obviously, this is a horror which has touched all the lives of Palestinians from Gaza in the most hideous way. And unfortunately, Ahmed is no exception. His brother was killed by the Israeli state earlier this year. I mean, it's such an honor to be able to speak to you. Always very humble to be able to speak to people like yourself in circumstances which people like myself can try and imagine, but there's always a barrier there. And I know how hard, well, I can only imagine how hard it is to talk about this. So just thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Owen. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I made a decision quite early on when the genocide started to boycott media completely. So I had requests from the BBC and Channel 4 and others to kind of appear on interviews and things like that. But I made a conscious decision to not appear there. And the reason for that was because I felt that they were complicit in this genocide and because they actually prepared the groundwork for what is happening right now. And I remember tweeting about it and talking about it, saying like what you're seeing on TV now, and a lot of people actually did as well, was similar to kind of the prelude to the Iraq war or the Afghan war, where thousands and thousands and millions were killed. So pleased to be here because this is not, the BBC or the others. I'm still in the same position. I'm not going to go and speak to them at all. I was cornered once by the BBC when I did a play last year, and this journalist came in and really wanted to talk to me, but I said no, and I held my ground for it. But yeah, it's great to be able to talk to like-minded people and to reach to people who understand, because I think we need that. We need that so much, people who understand, or at least try to understand, rather than judge us immediately.
Amen to that. And I think that point about Western media complicity in all of this, I've interviewed, for example, Ahmed Al-Naouk, the co-founder of We Are Not Numbers, and that point he's made very strongly, that he says the Western media killed his family alongside everybody else. So I'm glad you've raised that to begin with. Just to begin with, I mean, can you just tell me, you grew up in Gaza, so you left in 2002. Can you just tell me a bit about growing up in Gaza? At the time, it was under direct Israeli, of course, military occupation when you were there. Can you just tell me a bit, just that experience and how it kind of shaped your work as well, I suppose?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really interesting because at the moment, like, because of what is happening in Gaza and the unimaginable destruction, where Gaza is being completely erased from the map, buildings, streets, cafes, restaurants, mosques, universities, hospitals, everything that a city has. A lot of people, especially my friends on social media and people I'm in touch with on the ground, they're constantly posting pictures of Gaza before the war, before the genocide, and how beautiful it was. And yes, I agree to a large extent. It was a beautiful city. Gaza is a Mediterranean city in the end. Think of Napoli, think of Alexandria, think of any Mediterranean city with its little alleys and cafes and restaurants and beautiful Jerusalem stone houses. It was beautiful indeed. However, it was a very, very, very difficult place to live in, with very high unemployment rate, borders completely sealed. We weren't allowed to have our own airport or our own access to the port, the seaport, completely controlled from all sides by Israel. Now, people say that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and Gaza was left its own in a sense. And that's true. They withdrew troops from Gaza, from the ground. But however, they controlled everything else, including, as they boasted themselves, including the calories that we ate at the time. So Gaza before the genocide was always an open air prison. It was described as an open air prison, and it remained, and now it got even worse. In 2009, I was in London. My mum had cancer in Gaza, and Gaza was completely sealed. There was no way to get in or out of Gaza. There was no. She had a bowel cancer, and there was no colostomy bags for her to use. And I remember trying to join the Freedom Flotilla boat in 2009, which is an activist movement that tried to break the siege on Gaza through sailing from Cyprus to Gaza. They succeeded once or twice, but other times Israel rammed the boat and arrested everybody on board. And I remember in 2009 going to Cyprus, getting ready to get on the boat, and going around hospitals and clinics in Larnaca in Cyprus, asking them and begging them for colostomy bags. And their reaction was so, like, I'll never forget it. But they would say, but why wouldn't you have colostomy bags in Gaza? And I couldn't answer. I was like, I don't know why. I really don't know why, And that is the sort of thing that Israel did, that they controlled things to make life as hard as possible, sometimes without justification, most of the time without justification. And they always used the kind of security sort of threat around it, etc. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I didn't go in the boat because the boat was delayed. The border opened for about 3 days. I flew to Cairo, long journey into Gaza, got into Gaza, and I got stuck there for 6 months. I lost my job in London, ran out of money, and it took a miracle to get out. And that was in 2009, by the way, where the whole border was completely sealed in there. So you can imagine when people talk of Gaza before the war, yes, it was beautiful because people, in the end, a place has memories, people have a relationship to it, no matter how hard it is. I miss it so much. I miss growing up there in Jabalia camp, which was very, very difficult. We didn't have a proper sewage system, for example. I lived in a small house in the camp where it was covered with asbestos sheets, which made it like a baking oven in summer and like a freezer in winter, because it doesn't protect at all. But I still miss it. I still miss those days. I still miss, the sense of family and security and community. Well, not so much security, because the Israeli soldiers were there all the time, shooting whenever they wanted, arresting whenever they wanted. So, yeah, that's what it was like. Beautiful. I mean, a beautiful place. So imagine driving from Cairo to Gaza, which is my route, my journey, because again, as I said, we don't have an airport. Sometimes it takes 3 to 5 days to get from Cairo to Gaza because of all the checkpoints. You sleep on the road, and all of these things. And then you're driving through the Sinai, and it's a desert, and it's a beautiful desert, by the way, really beautiful. And you drive through the Sinai, and as you get close to Gaza, you see this green oasis over there in the distance, and that is Gaza. And it's a massive difference between like that desert kind of drive to this green land in a way.
I mean, your work has always kind of fleshed out the kind of, Vanish, the mysterious disappearance of Mustafa Uda. I mean, that was set over a long period, wasn't it, throughout Gaza's history? Can you just tell me about that and kind of the experiences that you fed on, or to in that work that kind of tell us about Gaza throughout that period?
I mean, with my writing, that's what I've always tried to do, by the way, because I've lived in the prison called Gaza, as it were. And now I feel like I'm living out of prison, as it were. I've tried my writing to I tried to kind of get people there, to take them there and describe Gaza as it really is, with its beautiful streets and shops and cafes, etc., etc. Without so much kind of telling them more about the history and the political situation, but more about through telling a personal story and just a narrative that is normal, and could happen anywhere else. So I write about people and their stories and their interactions. And guess what? We are a nation. We have the good and the bad. We have the hero and the villain. We're not some sort of extraterrestrial people that are just called Gaza, and that they should be killed, or we're not some human animals as the Israelis described us. There are people, beautiful people, and there are people who are trying to climb on top of each other to kind of make money or whatever. This is normal in any conflict situation.
Mm-hmm.
So when I write, like in Vanish, there are a number of characters that I paint that actually reflect that. Come what may, the same thing. Like the main character's husband is killed, and she's trying to find his murderer. And he was murdered by a Palestinian. So, we do have murders, we do have conflicts like that. So I try with my writing to kind of get this idea that we are a normal kind of society, but come and experience us, come and smell us, come and smell the food, come and smell the streets and the cafes and the music, and hear us, etc. But unfortunately, with my writing, like it's especially in the UK, because I am Palestinian, it's almost like I am not even allowed to put my voice on. It's not so easy. It's very, very challenging. It's this idea of censorship that actually it's quite scary, to be honest with you, that people refuse your work just because of who you are, because you are Palestinian. It's practically racist, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I've had events and theater and plays cancelled, and people haven't even read it. They haven't even read it to actually say anything about it, or say, well, actually, no, this doesn't fit with us or whatever. Because all I write is just about people and human stories. It's funny though, because I was remembering yesterday, a few years ago, about 10 years ago, I wrote a short story about Gaza set in 2048. And it's a fantasy kind of story about Gaza winning the right to host the Olympics, the 2048 Olympics. And it's a joke. And there's two geek guys, they submit this application to the IOC and they win it. And then it's like, oh, shit, what do we do? And they start preparing for the Olympics. So it was published in a book called Palestine Plus 100 as a short story. And then it was sort of adapted into a radio drama, which played in Germany in WDR, which is a very famous radio station and channel. It's a bit like Channel 4 in the UK, I suppose. And for the last few Olympics, every Olympics, they played it and sent me my royalties and, all of that, my paycheck for it, which was great. This is the first time they haven't. Which I was very surprised about. And then I thought, but why wouldn't they? Every Olympics they play it because it is about the Olympics. It's kind of a bit of a joke play or whatever. But then I remembered, okay, it's because of what's happening in Germany at the moment. They can't even play something they've already played, something that they're so confident and happy about and paid the fee. That's why I mentioned the fee in there before. And now it's like this silencing of everything Palestinian in Europe and in the UK specifically. So it's really, really like a shame. It's a struggle. And I really hope that this will change at some point, because in order for things to change, our voice needs to be elevated as much as possible as well.
It's striking, isn't it? Cancel culture, all that discussion about so-called cancel culture seems to have stopped after the 7th of October. You barely actually hear it talked about. And many of the people who spoke about free speech being stifled are the very people who have led this attempt to silence, well, particularly Palestinian voices, actually. I mean, this deliberate attempt, just including various forms of art. We've seen as well, I mean, Germany, Jewish and German Israeli authors who stand out, speak out for Palestine have been silenced. What hope, I suppose, for Palestinian voices in those circumstances?
Exactly. And I mean, I think and also the shameful thing about it is what we talk about, what I talk about, for example, on Twitter and stuff, is my family, my personal stories. One of them is like vile things I saw in there, that when I posted about a picture of my sister who's in Jabalia when she was pregnant, and she's had her baby now a couple of months. Her baby's 2 months old. But when I posted saying I'm so worried about her and her pregnancy and her not being able to go to hospital and get support and all of these things, the responses and the provocation from sort of Zionist lobbies and some comments were vile, absolutely vile. Of course, we ignore sort of social media things, and especially Twitter or X or whatever. You do ignore it, but then you realize that you kind of think like, how could people think like that? How could people really put us in that situation where there are people suffering at the moment? There are people like being starved to death. I've got some messages from my sister yesterday. Actually, he was in Jabalia. She was like, basically, all she's dreaming of is like a cucumber and some tomatoes to make a salad. Can you imagine? And that is just like, and that is something that we are witnessing live on TV, in a sense, that people are being starved to death. Let's forget for a second about the killing and all the murders and everything. But the idea that you put people somewhere and you starve them, you cut off food, you cut off electricity, you cut off everything, and you let them die. And so many of them have died. Actually, I know people in Jabalia who are neighbors and friends of friends, and who actually died because of lack of medication, lack of food, and all of these things. And it is allowed to happen. In other parts in Gaza, it's the constant bombardment. Constantly, people are moving from one place to the other, and that's what I talk about. I talk about somebody who's been forcibly removed from their place like 5 or 6 times. Even now, as we speak, last night they gave orders to an area in Khan Yunis to evacuate again. But where do people go? Like how are we just like looking at this and allowing it to happen? And then the moment you start to discuss it and talk about it, and then as if it's like, oh, like you can't do this, but because you haven't mentioned the other side. And I'm like, but I'm talking about my family and my friends, So yeah, really frustrating at the moment.
When your family, of course, lived through previous onslaughts, but this was from the beginning. Obviously, it was always going to be very clear, something of a completely different order. Can you just talk me through it? Because you've got you've one brother who was obviously killed horrifically. You had 3 brothers, 5 sisters, your mother, you got nephews and nieces. When this all began, what was going through your head? What was, did you were you able to communicate right at the start with your family, and what was kind of going through your head about what was likely to happen?
Well, I think this is like the worst thing that happened in this genocide and this war. And I think it doesn't happen very often elsewhere, which is the fact that Israel cut off communication completely on Palestinians. That was actually the worst feeling. That was actually the hardest thing, and still is, by the way, because a lot of people don't have access to the internet. A lot of people, they've destroyed the infrastructure, like the telecommunication infrastructure, purposely, of course. But I remember back in October when there was one weekend, there was a big blackout over Gaza, and imagine you're somewhere else and you just don't know. You just don't know whatever happens. You could get connected, at the end of that weekend, and your entire family is killed. Your entire neighborhood is destroyed. Anything could have happened. And trying to find news, trying to follow news, trying to find out what's happening. But this time it's just been very, very difficult to do that. And it's been really, really taxing for us, for anybody who's from Gaza, who knows very well the situation, who knows the area, who knows that Khan Yunis is a tiny place, really. So when they're bombing Khan Yunis, you could hear it in Jabalia. It's not, the whole of Gaza is 36 kilometers, long. So it's not that big. They kept talking of Rafah as if it's Leningrad or something like this. It's one street, really. So that's been really, really difficult, and still is. So I can't connect easily to my nephews and nieces, to my sisters. So right now, I hear that there's bombing in Nusayrat, middle of Gaza. I can't easily call her and check on her, and that's been really, really difficult. My own mother, I managed to evacuate her from Gaza back in April, just the day before the Rafah border closed. But for months before that, I didn't know if she was alive or not. And imagine that feeling, waking up every day, going to work, going to do getting on with your daily routine, not knowing if your mom is alive or not. And you can't even connect to her. She herself, my brother was killed in January in like a really horrific attack where he was bombed by a drone, wasn't killed immediately. He was left on the street for 3 days bleeding until he was found by his own kids. And as he was found and they put him on a donkey cart because there was no ambulance or anything to rush him to hospital, he died with them. There is comfort in that he died with the people he loved and, closed his eyes as he saw his kids and said goodbye. But the fact that he wasn't allowed, access to medication, the fact that he was bleeding for 3 days, the fact that if there was one hospital or a medic or whatever, he could still be with us right now. That thought just torments me. What is worse than that my own mother, his own mother, didn't know about his death until 3 months later because there was no connection. She was in Khan Yunis. She had left Jabalia in December when that pause happened, and she thought, as we were told, that the south and Khan Yunis was safe. But of course, now we know that that was all part of their plan to expel people from the north of Gaza. Yeah, so it was one of the most horrific things that I had to experience, and having to deal with that, deal with the grief. And I haven't been able to deal with the grief yet because I've been trying to support my
Mhm.
nephews and nieces, my brother's kids. My mum, I went to see her in Egypt a few weeks ago. And it was the most difficult, one of the most difficult things I've done in my life, because that woman, who's now 75 years old, and he lost her son that she didn't know about, and then her other son just comes in, and she's just like clinging and hanging on as if I've just come back from the dead, or
Mhm.
something, so, and that's just one example. I mean, I still like feel I'm kind of one of the lucky ones in a sense, because other families have experienced other far more horrific things. We managed to bury my brother in the
Mhm.
main cemetery in Jabalia, where my dad was buried last year. Unfortunately, when the Israelis went into Jabalia again, they destroyed the cemetery and destroyed the graves and everything. So for me, I will never have that closure for him to go and stand by his grave and
Mhm.
cry a little, and say goodbye, as it were. Yeah. But again, like I said, we are one of the lucky ones to actually be able to find his body, and to bury him, and for his kids to have that closure. But imagine if all the thousands of people that still have hope that their children might still be alive under the rubble or in
Mhm.
an Israeli prison. Um, and when I was in Egypt, I was talking to my mum, and she said something that made me cry, really. She said that if she would have a choice between, when the Israelis invade, between her children being killed or arrested by the Israelis, she would rather that they're killed. Can you imagine? Can
Mhm.
you imagine that? And I was like, wow, and I was like, but why is that? She said, have you not heard what they're doing there?
Mhm.
And now more things are coming out of, abuse of Palestinian hostages. I call them, and for a mother to say that, it means that what she knows and what people know is far, far greater than what we're getting over here.
I mean, I can't even imagine the grieving process, as to kind of the assault on the grieving process, as well as everything else, the constant anxiety mixed in with all of that, of course, for the rest of your family still there in Gaza. I mean, and what's it like? The fact, we're here, we're talking here in Britain, not that far away from where we both sit, the seat of government, that your family going through this, and the knowledge that this government has armed and is arming Israel, has provided diplomatic support, supported Israel's genocidal onslaught from the start. I mean, the way that much of the media, of course, has framed this
Mm.
from the very beginning. I mean, what's that? Just maybe talk me through a bit, knowing what your family's gone through, your
Yeah,
brother being killed, and that kind of backdrop.
I think people there completely look at the UK as a party, as a complicit party of this genocide. The UK, it's the same as the US, as the Israel as well. If you speak to my mum, she would tell you that there are British drones flying over Gaza. They know them. They know the difference between the British drones and the Israeli drones, by the way. I don't know how, but they do, because people have lived under this
Mm.
surveillance state for a long time, and they know. She would tell you that there are British soldiers fighting in Gaza along the Israeli army. She would tell you how angry she is about the UK basically interfering against the ICC case with the arrest warrant against Netanyahu. She would tell you how angry that the armed trade is still going by the British government to Israel. British weapons being used for genocide. So I think people there are incredibly, incredibly frustrated and angry that not even a ceasefire has been called by the British government. And the reason why they're angry is, I mean, kind of expected that Britain would support Israel. They're like, in the end, Britain created Israel in Palestine.
Mm.
So, but they see other examples of like Spain, for example, or Belgium or Norway, who are trying to kind of put in influence, who are trying to make a change. I mean, can you imagine if all the international community got together and after the ICJ ruling back in January decided to force Israel to do just that and to stop the genocide? Can you imagine how many lives we would have saved by now? Can you imagine that how much that would have opened in terms of negotiations, in terms of building a real opportunity for peace? Because we also have to have hope, and people in Gaza also have a bit of hope to say that this is it, this is the last time, we don't want to be there anymore, nobody wants to be there anymore. So I'm hoping that out of this destruction and darkness and all of these things, that some sort of real hope for peace will be born. But it does need an international kind of commitment, and does need some real pressure put on Israel. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. They've got a government who are complete nutters. They're complete nutters. They're calling for, the starvation of. Only yesterday, Smotrich and others called for the starvation of Gaza of 2.3 million people, and there to be starved to death. They constantly talk about occupying Gaza and ethnically cleansing Gaza and the rest of Palestine. They were also talking about Jenin in the West Bank to do the same in there, and that is allowed. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. Just go and kill 2 million people. It's okay. So yeah, they're really, really angry with the UK position in there. And they haven't seen any change, like with the new government. I haven't either, in terms of, we've got a new Labour government. They're supposed to be on the left. It's supposed to be a bit more kind of supportive and understanding, but it's the same policy, to be honest.
I mean, links to that, the media, we mentioned that earlier. I worked in the British media industry for a long time. So I don't say this, whenever I say this, I'm not saying this from a position of naivety. I'm not surprised. But the lack of subtlety involved in the just dehumanization of Palestinian life, and I speak as someone obviously who isn't Palestinian, so that's why I'm asking the impact. Just your view, because there's just so little subtlety. I mean, almost if you were to erase the dynamics and the history and the context, if you were to just start from the position of Palestinians being equal human beings, then you would have screened for this to end, as in the media, from day one. So just what's that like? Just living through that, just seeing that dehumanization on a daily basis, and how that expresses itself.
It's very, very difficult and very hard because, I mean, yeah, it allows others also to dehumanize us. It allows people in our daily lives, at work or in the street or whatever it is, because that's what people see. They see the media, they see the BBC, they see how they address you, they see what your position in the human ranking is, and they treat you like that, basically, as a second-class citizen, as somebody who's not even a human, doesn't have proper human rights, as it were. But there are so many examples from the media where they just don't, if you think about sort of basically reporting numbers, right? There's always followed by 100 Palestinians died rather than were killed by Israel, as reported by the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. It's like even that, the Hamas Ministry of Health, Hamas-run Ministry of Health, that basically is saying to you, don't care about those people. They're all liars. They're all terrorists. We don't even believe their numbers. Let them confuse, etc. But those 100 people I know yesterday were killed, innocent civilians that were there taking shelter in that school. Many, 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 many other examples that I can pick on today. But it basically dehumanizes you. It makes you somebody who's not worth discussing their lives, and that translates into other things, as I said, like your daily life, your work, theater, culture, which is sort of my scene and my sector, as it were. And when people are scared, it's like, you're Palestinian, you're not quite right. I'm not sure I'm gonna put things on. Like, I've got a play in Edinburgh now. The Shroud Maker is playing in Edinburgh. And it's testament to the production company and the Jordan company, production company, that went to and took that brave decision. But it took a long time to convince everybody to put it on. And people were just like scared and doubtful, and read the script several times, and all of these things, like forensic looking into, I'm going to find a problem with this. I am going to find, because the media tells me he's not a human. He must be awful, Whereas some writer who's writing, I don't know, about anything, yeah, great, do it, but yeah, that's the reality that we live in at the moment. But things like also, I mean, I've been lucky with my work in London here that it's been fine, but I hear from my friends where they've been, targeted by colleagues. They've been harassed by colleagues, by their workplace as well. They haven't been given the support and time off to deal with their grief and what is happening. And us as British Palestinians who are here, the government hasn't reached out to us at all to see what support they can give. They haven't even we've been asking for like a family reunion scheme, similar to the Ukraine one. Nothing, no engagement whatsoever. We got together, we organized ourselves. There are various groups working on this with lawyers and all of these things. They haven't even budged. They haven't even changed their position at all, which is really, really ridiculous. I mean, there has been nobody from Gaza who has made it here, which is ridiculous. There are about 200,000 people in Gaza who left Gaza to Egypt now for various reasons, whether it's medication or study or whatever. That's before the border was closed. None of those people, I think one kid actually made it to Wales, and that's it. But apart from that, nobody else was allowed or granted entry on a humanitarian basis.
Just lastly on that, I mean, following from that question, maybe seems, well, just in given the context, I find it's kind of a slightly difficult question to ask. But I mean, do you see any hope? I mean, partly we've seen the polling of Western public opinion, including the US, has been a dramatic shift in support of the Palestinian people. The polling shows in Britain, large majorities think war crimes have been committed, that an arms embargo should be instituted. A recent poll showed a large majority support the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, do you see in that any hope, the fact that public opinion has shifted and that in time that must have a political expression, that governments in the US and elsewhere, I mean, we can see obviously the US presidential elections. Do you see that pressure coming to bear? I mean, is that where you think the hope, partly because of the work of Palestinian journalists, I have to say, biggest journalists in history, showing the world what's actually happening, has had a big impact, particularly on younger generations?
Yeah, I would like to think so. I mean, our great poet Mahmoud Darwish, who died in 2008, he said, in describing Palestinians, he said, we do what the prisoners do, we cultivate hope. And we also have another saying in Arabic that says, وَمَا أَضْيَقُ الْعَيْشِ لَوْلَا فُسْحَةَ الْأَمَلِ, and that life is so claustrophobic without the vastness of hope. And I think there is hope. I think, like I said, I was referring to it earlier, I think the hope is that this is it, that both Palestinians and Israelis in general will learn from this, that they both can't get rid of each other. We're there together forever, So what we need is a political process that ensures the rights of all civilians to be protected and to be equal as much as possible. And this is where the hope is that the world will start to see the problem is not just about ceasefire. It's not just about what happened in October or whatever. It's beyond that. It's about ensuring that there is a political process that ensures the rights, the civil rights of everybody who lives there as equal. And that's really, really important and key. I think the international pressure is mounting, of course. And I feel a lot of the work that the journalists have done in Palestine, which has then been sort of translated into like student protests, and young generation across Europe and the US and others, it is making a difference, of course. But I think it needs a stance, a political stance where, like, a boycott of arms trade or whatever it is against Israel. And then that will translate into real pressure, because otherwise it's just words at the moment. Just, Keir Starmer, we want a lasting ceasefire that ensures aid gets in and the hostages are returned. Great. Everybody wants that. But what does that even mean? It's just a politician talk. And of course, Israel knows this and they won't do anything. They won't change anything at all. I think there is a change, and I'm grateful for everybody who's engaging, who's sharing our stories, who's sharing, even like just retweeting, reposting, resharing. People underestimate the power that has. Like you said, that those journalists, this is how they're getting. They're not getting it on the BBC and Channel 4 or anything. They're getting it on social media, which in turn is actually censoring us a lot. Meta hides our posts, and there is an algorithm, anything pro-Palestinian. So I think the more that people share would be amazing. The more that people read our stories, our literature, our books, our poems, everything, and share it, because that gives us humanity. That gives us our humanity that deserves it again. That we're not just numbers either. We're not just numbers. We are people with humans. We write poems, we write songs, share everything, food recipes, and all of these things. Because if we lose our land, Gaza and Palestine, I don't want us to lose our culture as well, which belongs to us. Nobody can take that from us.
Absolutely not. Your humanity shines through, I have to say, all the way through this conversation. I know through your work. I hope everyone who's listened to this, watched this, goes and checks out your work. I'll include links so people can read what your incredible work, very acclaimed work, I have to say. I can't imagine, again, the conditions being an artist, being, expressing and thinking and emotion, expressing that at a time like this. Difficult to imagine what that's like, but it's been such an honor. For everyone who's listened or watched, please share this. Make sure his voice is heard loud and clear. Press like, subscribe, leave comments. Good for algorithm. But honestly, it's been such an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.